The Dig is a podcast produced in conjunction with Jacobin Magazine. And yes, Jacobin is a print publication, not just a place for online commentary, but long-form, serious print journalism and socialist analysis. The magazine is released quarterly and runs at around 160 pages, filled with award-winning design and the ideas that movements need to thrive. You can join more than 70,000 Jacobin subscribers supporting this vital work for just $15 for your first year. This is a huge discount available to Dig listeners. $15 gets you an entire year of Jacobin in print and access to the magazine's very extensive archive. You can access this deal by going to bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase. That's bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase. There's a link in the show notes.
Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Jackson Roach, and I'm broadcasting from Chicago, Illinois. I'm The Dig's associate producer, and I'm recording this introduction on Dan's behalf because he just recorded 2 live shows here in Chicago and then headed straight to the Adirondacks, where he couldn't find a recording studio. This episode is a discussion of the emerging conjuncture with Aslı Bâli and Gabriel Winant, conducted before a live audience at the Socialism 2025 conference, which just happened over the July 4th weekend. Dan, Aslı, and Gabe talk about the Trump regime's fascist, authoritarian second coming, the giant vacuum created by the Democratic establishment's failure to act like an opposition party, and the resurgent creative energy now coming so powerfully from our political forces on the socialist left. Before we get started, though, a reminder that The Dig is made possible, overwhelmingly, thanks to listeners like you, who support us at patreon.com/thedig. We don't paywall anything because we want every single person to listen to every single episode. This is first and foremost a political education project. The miracle is this actually works. A substantial but relatively small percentage of listeners making contributions keeps this podcast running. Your contributions are, for example, what allow for me and The Dig's producer, Alex Lewis, to get paid for the work that we do, to put out The Dig nearly every week. We do everything we can to support you with the ruthless criticism of everything that you need. Please return the favor. Support The Dig with a contribution. The link is in the show notes. Click it. That's patreon.com/thedig. Okay, here's Aslı Bâli and Gabriel Winant. Aslı Bâli is a professor of law at Yale Law School who focuses on public international law. In addition to her scholarship, she has published essays and op-eds in such venues as the New York Times, the Boston Review, the London Review of Books, Jacobin, and Dissent. Before joining academia, she was a practicing lawyer who worked both in private practice and for the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. She currently serves as president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America, co-chair of the advisory board for the Middle East Division of Human Rights Watch, and is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Gabriel Winant teaches history at the University of Chicago. His first book was The Next Shift, The Fall of Industry and the Rise of Healthcare in Rust Belt America. He is currently an officer of the American Association of University Professors.
Thank you everyone so much for coming. With no further ado, we're going to dive in. Aslı Bâli and Gabe Winant, welcome back to The Dig.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks, Dan.
To start off, Zoran Mamdani's victory is an absolute nationwide earthquake, and we're not even close to being done feeling the aftershocks. What do you make of the size and nature of this historic upset, and what are the implications for how we move forward? Gabe, am I correct to say that this is the most significant socialist electoral victory in our lifetime, and maybe the most significant in a far longer time than that?
Yeah, I was thinking about this. I do think that it's hard to come up with a comparison, at least one that ended in victory, right? Obviously, the Bernie phenomenon is sort of larger in scale and contained within the ultimate defeat many important victories that are still reverberating with us today. But socialists in this country have never captured an executive office of such importance or won such a decisive victory. I mean, the comparisons you could make, one might be the Henry George campaign in 1886 for mayor of New York, which is often seen as a moment when the kind of emerging industrial class conflict of the late 19th century burst into electoral politics. And, we often sort of cite that as historians as a moment that kind of gestures toward the beginning of the progressive era and the political movements of then. But George lost. He lost by not much, but he lost. Another would be Fiorello LaGuardia, who is, would call himself a socialist and was obviously a kind of major important mayor of New York. But LaGuardia got elected mayor after the New Deal had started. And so, in a way, he was sort of downstream, historically, from the larger national shift toward the left, and so didn't mark a rupture in quite the same way. There have been other DSA mayors, David Dinkins included in New York City, Ron Dellums in Oakland, but the DSA kind of identity was sort of incidental, and they were basically just like sort of liberal Democrats. So I don't think you can really straightforwardly find anything of such significance in our history on the same plane. And I guess just to start our discussion of it, beyond the historical examples, I would say, I think that what's so significant about it, what gives it such power, is two things. One, it completely buries the idea that the cycle of political and social upheaval kicked off by the 2008 financial crisis and playing out through Occupy, through Black Lives Matter, through Bernie, that is in some way over, right? Which is a story I think that was often told over the last 5 years, that generational cycle of upheaval had ended. I think now we can see really clearly this is continuous with that phenomenon, and the continuity is in DSA.
And that the millennial left was dead in particular.
Right, yes, the millennial left lives. Second, and related to that, is I think it buries the idea that the discontent on the left wing of the Democratic Party and beyond, related to Palestine, related to just in general the effort to kind of silence the left and make us shut the hell up in the name of holding off fascism, that is a viable strategy for containing us. I think that Zoran proves really decisively that we actually can't be contained that way, and that in fact we have a distinctive leadership role to play in the battle against authoritarianism. So I'll stop there. I think there's lots more to say about it.
Yeah, Aslı.
I'll just chime in with a few things that just piggyback on that, because I agree with absolutely everything Gabe said and that Dan said in interjection. But I would add that Zoran showed that it's possible in today's politics to assemble a coalition that is basically made up of white and blue-collar workers together with immigrants and with that youth vote. That can be made plausible. It can be a coalitional strategy that works. And that's a really important lesson. Of course, it's a lesson that center Democrats appear not to be taking. So what we've seen in the immediate aftermath is the totally predictable Republican racist backlash towards the primary election, but also the kind of racist light response from center Democrats, especially in New York State, and more generally a kind of hand-wringing that is reminiscent of the Harris campaign in general, which is the notion that somehow this represents a kind of politics that's fatal to the Democratic Party instead of the vital base that energizes its constituencies. And this, I think, is an indication of the enduring alienation of the large majority of the base of the Democratic Party from establishment leadership that we're seeing play out in the aftermath of this electoral victory. But I think it is also indicative of a couple of other things. If there's going to be a meaningful left strategy for the midterms, it really is about this debate that's internal to the Democratic Party between the left and the center, and about winning on these terms an argument that says to the center, actually the positions, the triangulation, the compromise, the running away from marginalized communities, none of that works. And that you can actually run an effective campaign without ceding any ground to Republican talking points, including on Gaza, and by explaining the positions that you've taken, and critically, of course, basic retail politics, listening to constituencies, engaging with people, building a communication strategy that's effective for the 21st century. I mean, there are so many blueprints that are present, but the really critical thing I think that's come into focus in the aftermath of the election is just how profound, even in the face of electoral victory, that rift remains between the base that brought Mamdani, which is a broad base, as I've just named it. It is not just a youth vote. It is not just an Occupy vote. He has a very substantial coalition of New Yorkers behind him. Even in the midst of the race baiting and the allegations of anti-Semitism, he performed second amongst Jewish voters in New York. I mean, this is a very substantial coalition. But instead of embracing and learning from that, what we see is replicating the failed strategy of 2024.
Let's turn to our enemies on the right. From my vantage point, MAGA 2.0 is clearly overreaching in all sorts of ways and undermining the conditions for their own coalition. It's hard to look at Trump and see the outlines of a truly hegemonic project that can effectively stitch together all these disparate social forces that make up MAGA. Tariffs, mass deportations, these recent catastrophic Medicaid cuts, bombing Iran, brutal state repression, the gutting of the federal government with Doge, all of it runs into a rather contradictory coalition in a rather contradictory set of ways. Asla, is hegemony even the point, or alternately, in the words of Ranjit Guha that I keep returning to recently, is the right pursuing more a strategy of dominance without hegemony, or is it some sort of strategy of remaking the terrain maximally in their favor as much as possible in a short period of time before they know they're going to lose the midterms, for example? Or maybe is it more short-termist and even nihilistic and just about smashing and grabbing everything they can while they can?
I feel like those last two things are basically the same. I mean, I do think there's a kind of smash and grab nihilism. I'll come back to that. But to start with, I think it's important to point out what you say at the beginning in framing this question, which is that there is a kind of lack of ideological cohesion. So in this last bill, we see so-called moderate Republicans signing up to slash Medicaid. We see conservative Republicans ballooning the federal debt. I mean, all of the kinds of supposed principles. And again here, by the way, I see a lesson for the Democrats, which is essentially the Republicans, as long as they're able to secure basic gains for core constituencies they care about, which is, you know, the kind of theatrical gains for Trump, but then core gains for the wealthy plutocrats that they represent, they're willing to jettison basically all of the other platform or positions, no matter how wedded they appear to be to them for decades. Now, why is this the case? I do think there is a kind of nihilism. I think they see that, you know, this is a party that is fundamentally using minoritarian instruments of power to cobble together electoral victories when they're able to get them. And I think they understand that they are going to lose very likely in the midterms, not so much because of democratic competence or other aspects of our politics, but just like the historical longue durée pattern of the president's party losing in midterm elections pretty consistently. And so in that context, I do think there's a kind of nihilism at work here, which is essentially an ambition in the case of Trump and those that have enabled him, the kind of interregnum planners of the Project 2025 and the Project Esther and what have you. They have an ambition that's almost FDR-esque in scale, I would say, except it's inverse in that it's destructive. It's about dismantling as much as is possible around the obstacles that they recognize to their own sites of interest and their sites of electoral power. So doing harm actually to majoritarian politics, enabling the wealthy, harming their enemies, and there's a whole plethora of ways in which they've done this. But I think that there's also a fundamental idea that if they smash up the sort of existing institutional base, if they engender a rupture, that may actually lay a terrain for a new kind of politics that they can author. Because at the end of the day, their politics of rupture at the moment involves a kind of opening that is an opportunity across the board. It's an opportunity for the left. I hope we get to talk about that a lot today. But it's also just as much an opportunity for the right. I mean, there's a fundamental anti-elite politics at work in the country, and they might imagine that, one, they're going to get all the short-term benefits of the smash and grab politics of the moment, but two, by sort of resetting the terrain in the ways that they've done, they open up the possibility that there'll be many different kinds of backlash politics at work at the midterms, and so they have opportunities to capitalize further by trying to, you know, advance their most extreme agendas.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think, you know, the question of hegemony, I think, is a challenging one because I don't think we know, or I don't think we've seen in recent memory, in anyone's living memory, in the capitalist core societies, a ruling class that did not, in some way, seem to have some kind of hegemonic vision and project, something constructive, a set of compromises to make with internal challengers, a way of kind of incorporating some of its opposition. That seems to be like a fundamental component of the politics of, you know, core society, liberal, whatever, as long as we've known it since, I think, the early 20th century, if not further. And the idea of dominance without hegemony, which you referred to, right, comes from the imperial, you know, the imperialist sort of subordinated parts of the world. So there is obviously a kind of boomerang effect there. It's seeing that reversal and that boomerang that authorizes the kind of invocation of a fascist threat in some form, I think. It does seem to me that also is true on the global scale, right? Certainly the U.S. ruling class seems to be as invested as ever, more invested than ever, in a certain kind of global dominance. But the idea that dominance is constructed through a internationally hegemonic project of, enlisting the support of a wide coalition of national ruling classes, under kind of slightly abstract principles, right? The liberal international order was the name for this, right? They've thrown that out the window too. So it's dominance without hegemony on a global scale. And now it's just, woe to the conquered seems to be the model. And I struggle with I think that's the symptoms that we're seeing and the threats that we face, right? And we see it in the bill that was just passed also, right? In the form of the increase by 20-fold of the budget for ICE, right? That would appear to be, again, a kind of model of dominance without hegemony, because we all know that revving up the deportation machine to a level, never seen before cannot actually solve any of the social problems that the right promises that it will solve or proposes that it will solve. This is how they ran in 2020, right? That, oh, you're worried about housing costs? We'll deport illegal immigrants, right? In quotes for people who are listening. Oh, you're worried about healthcare? We'll deport people. Oh, you're worried about wages and jobs? We'll deport people. That's not going to do any of that. And they know it and we know it. And so again, that would appear to be a case of dominance without hegemony. But I think there's a kind of deeper level where we don't have an answer, which is, why is this ruling class fraction that's currently in power, why does it feel so empowered to pursue dominance without hegemony? Why are they so unconcerned with the set of questions that have historically concerned every ruling class that we've known in this society and similar societies? How can that be? What does it tell us about where we are on the kind of sundial clock of the history of capitalism? That was Josh Clover's phrase. And I've been thinking about that because I do think that what he might say, and what the phenomenon of dominance without hegemony seems to suggest, is a vision of capital accumulation that is basically unconcerned with the conditions under which labor power is secured. Right? That either they think that they can do sufficient accumulation without employing labor in the degree that they used to have to do, or they can employ labor only kind of through indirect colonial mechanisms, or exactly what it is not clear to me, I admit. But I think that we have to kind of start to think about what does it mean to have a ruling class that is not engaged enough directly in the class relation, that the kind of check that the class relation generated on that ruling class is no longer operative.
I want to get into a little later more of this question of the boomerang, but for now, this question of why, and the boomerang actually might be just consistently part of the answers to all of these questions, I guess, but it seems like with Trump's inauguration that the second term suddenly just ended this long-running fascism debate on the left, the fascism debate being the debate over whether Trump, his administration, MAGA more generally, are fascist. What gives the second Trump administration such a more clearly, dramatically authoritarian and fascist character than its first iteration? And then what factors, from the pandemic to the George Floyd uprising to January 6th to the genocide in Gaza, what factors do you believe played the most decisive roles in effectuating the radicalization on the American right? And then I'll add, what sort of factors were particularly important for particular parts of the ruling class? Because one important thing about MAGA 2.0 is the addition, for example, of tech, in the way Silicon Valley has come in so powerfully as a far-right force in American politics.
So there are so many things that I think are both continuous and different about Trump 1.0, Trump 2.0. But I think there's a set of consistent through lines. And so to the extent that the fascism debate has been resolved, if it's been resolved, it's primarily, I think, the passage of time in some respects and the crystallization of the underlying tendencies. But I'll just start with some continuities. I mean, for starters, there's just the presidency as spectacle. And so that way of, what people have called, the whatever theater of sadism, the politics of cruelty, the pornography of violence. I mean,
The
all
deportation
of those things.
ASMR.
Yeah, exactly. So the deportation ASMR, the chainsaw Musk on the stage, the Noam, photo op in El Salvador, the tweets like Shalom Mahmoud. I mean, all of this stuff is consistent, I think, with Trump 1.0, but like in a way just accelerated and intensified. And that's like one of the themes, I think, of the second Trump administration is that ability, the lack of constraint, the rules that were established in the first Trump administration basically were if you can lift the obstacles that he'd identified, whether they were in the courts or the administrative state or simply obtain the obeisance of Congress, then you can do more and more. And so a lot of what we're seeing is just testing exactly how much can be done. I mean, there's core lawlessness at this point, like just really open, like these are not sort of borderline questions of legality, it's just open illegality, whether it's violations of statutory interpretation, open defiance of court orders or court injunctions, or just defying the text of the Constitution. I mean, the whole birthright citizenship executive order is a classic example of this. And each of these, to my mind, is simply just a test of how far one can go to break what were presented as institutions or norms, all that kind of language, all the paper tigers of the first Trump administration are already gone. And the question is, how far can we go? But there is some novelty. And I think some of that novelty comes from, as I already suggested, the interregnum. So the first Trump administration, for all of its destructiveness, was chaotic, not just in the traditional Trump sense of chaos, in that the man is unpredictable and has no core and doesn't seem to have any stable commitments, but also in the sense that they just didn't expect to be in power. And so they really ran through a roster of people. They weren't really quite sure what they were doing. They were improvising when it came to policy. Then they had 4 years to plan meticulously. They announced those plans, as he said. His one big, beautiful bill is a delivery of a set of promises that he made explicit. You have blueprints, and those blueprints entail strategies to specifically go after the points of resistance that were identified in Trump 1. The first of those, of course, is the administrative state. So he did a lot in this regard, and the Republican Party laid the groundwork long ago with the theories of the unitary executive. So again, there's a story of continuity here, but this is also continuous with a playbook that he's learning from that's sequencing in the global context. There's a comparative story. There's I know most intimately the Turkish context, this idea of the deep state and that executive branch as needing to be remade through this idea of the unitary executive in a way that first of all defies basic principles of administrative state independence, civil service autonomy. All of that is gone. The administrative state is to be turned into a tool of the person in the presidency. And to do this, it's necessary to first eliminate almost everybody that's there. Those are ancien regime holdouts who are trying to be the resistance internally, et cetera, so just clean them out. So Doge did this in a way that we just didn't see in the first Trump administration. It just wasn't nearly as effective, rapid, et cetera. He promised to be a dictator on day one and absolutely delivered on that promise and has built on that a kind of momentum of a shock and awe theater, but also a reality of putting in place policy after policy after policy, both depleting the capacity to resist, right? One of the core strategies of resistance is litigation. There's only so many of these moves that you can litigate. There's only so much bandwidth in the courts, et cetera. He's also defying courts. And on the other hand, really overwhelming those who would try from within, internally in the state, to stop him or slow him by eliminating them and casting fear broadly, so sowing terror broadly in the administrative state. So you have that kind of novelty of acceleration. You also have an understanding that's much more sophisticated about the courts. So the courts were understood as the enemy and presented that way by Trump 1.0, but in that period, Trump remade the Supreme Court. He was able to get 3 justices in place. And so now you have a far-right Supreme Court overseeing a set of lower courts that at the district court level are still overwhelmingly Democratic nominees, something on the order of 60%. And then as you go up through the appellate courts, more and more Republicans. And so the strategy has been we defy district court orders. Actually, we sue district court judges. I mean, unprecedented sets of moves that are taking place to say we will allow only one court to make determinations about whether there are any checks on presidential power. That again, it is different, it's distinctive, but it's an acceleration. It's not a complete discontinuity with the earlier Trump administration. So again, back to my point of what we're seeing is a crystallization that ends the fascism debate more than some novel characteristics in my own view. There's also the reality of a completely transformed legislature in which you've purged Republicans that were prepared to stand up, and you have a Democratic Party that simply doesn't understand itself as an opposition. It refuses to enact opposition policies or politics, and it engages in a way that essentially makes it irrelevant as an obstacle. There is no obstacle at the legislative level. And so what's left then is federalism, state opposition, and there are strategies to go after that. So I think we can think about ICE in multiple ways. We can think about it, of course, as delivering on his racist, white nationalist project, dog whistles against migrants, but also, generally speaking, the bringing of coercion and violence to the fore as part of a governing strategy. But it's also a way to bring particular states to heel. So we're seeing that in California, where you not only have expanded, this last budget bill not only expands ICE dramatically, but also, of course, the Defense Department. So the security state and its domestic and global instantiation has been massively expanded and is being deployed both wings against unruly sets of actors within the United States. So there's the violence that's deployed individually against particular political opponents, but there's also the mass violence that's being deployed against municipalities, against states that would purport to resist. And we saw this most vividly with the use of the Marines in LA. Again, is this a complete break? Well, we saw what happened in the racial justice uprising in 2020 and the willingness to resort massively to force at the federal level, but we didn't have a federal law enforcement agency the size of ICE. So we now have, against the possible check of federalism, a federal law enforcement agency that is the largest we've ever had in our history, as Gabe just underscored with this budget, plus the ability to deploy the National Guard. So again, I'm going to stop with it is an acceleration. I think it does sort of end the debate, and it shifts again, I think, to my mind, the onus and the argument to the left to begin to offer an analysis of how do we organize in a moment like this, because to the extent that there was a debate about fascism, it was an internal debate, again, on the Democratic side, and today it's for the left to make some use of this new analysis and the new consensus around fascism.
One quick follow-up for you before we turn to you, Gabe. In terms of that international comparison you made to Erdogan, one distinct thing about what Trump seems to be up to right now is that there seems to be a theory that this administration can speed run the move to an authoritarian break actually much faster than Erdogan or Putin or anyone like that accomplished. Is that because of something particular to what happens when you try to do the Erdogan thing in the heart of the imperial core?
I mean, I think it's more actually the sort of learning curve and sequencing of all of these actors. So Erdogan, I mean, it sort of depends on how you look at the origin story of Orban, but I would say Erdogan really innovated a lot of these elements. And then Orban picked them up, and that was in direct conversation. I mean, there was actual, civil society links and movement of advisors and so on around Erdogan and Orban. It's very clear that the Israeli domestic political sphere also learned rapidly. And so, for example, the onslaught against the judiciary, which built over a decade in the Turkish context, moved much more quickly in both Hungary and Israel. And the same then is true in India today. So with every successive entrant, if you want, to this playbook of populist authoritarianism, we have seen acceleration. But in the case of Trump, I think it's further magnified by a couple of factors. I mean, one of them is the one that I named, which is that the groups that support him understand the brevity of the timeline that they face, that there's a real possibility that they have to exercise all the power that they've concentrated in their hands at the moment with control of all three branches within 2 years. And so that is an accelerant. They also laid the groundwork in the first 4 years. So I think we need to understand that we're in the 5th and 6th years. And so at years 5 and 6 in a second administration, you already saw momentum growing in the case of those earlier authoritarians that we just named. But ultimately, I think it is the case that in the United States, Trump has been able to harness a set of dynamics that have really turbocharged his efforts. And then we go back to your original question. If this is indeed a domination without hegemony, if this is indeed an idea of grabbing power and shifting the terrain, but without necessarily yet a clear constructive project, then the project that Trump is helming is pretty different from that of Erdogan and Orban and Netanyahu and Modi, all of whom had a clear vision of the thing they also had to create. We have yet to see something along those lines come into focus. And again, that's Gabe's earlier point, so I'm just going to echo it and agree with him one more time.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thing that we could imagine they will create is a new configuration of race in America and around the world. And I do think that that's helpful as a way of thinking about it in the kind of context of the fascism question, to the extent that it remains a question, and in the context of the dominance without hegemony kind of question. In other words, what is the social logic by which a predatory, extremely, socially isolated oligarchy that has an enormous concentration of wealth, what is the social logic by which it might construct a larger coalition around itself, right? The classic hegemonic logic would be a set of class compromises of one kind or another, right? Or material concessions of one form or another. We've just talked about how they seem not to be doing that. And what they have to offer in place of that, right, I think is an effort to reconstruct white supremacy on a new and larger and more aggressive and sort of reformulated scale. If you think about the reaction to Zoran's victory, for example, right, and the kind of construction of him as a jihadi communist, I'll admit, like perversely, I'll like look at these social media threads where people debate like, well, don't Shia Muslims actually like believe that you should hide your religious ideology in order to make your way in Western? It's like people think that Zoran is like a Shia Muslim sleeper agent, and that is, I think, a good illustration, although far from the only one, of the way that right-wing politics is engaged in a kind of reconstruction of the logic of white supremacy, the logic of race, renegotiating some of its margins and edges and so on, right? So there's a way in which, as has been much observed, right, Trump actually kind of has an appeal to offer to Mexican Americans. That's a kind of anti-immigrant appeal, right? And there's a logic of reconstructing race and reconstructing whiteness going on in that, as one example. The support for the Israeli genocide, right? Again, there is a logic of race. I think that's really important and sort of fundamental to that. And again, it's a logic of race that works in a context where you're not interested in accomplishing some kind of negotiated, semi-cooperative, semi-coercive settlement that everyone can, take something home from, right? It's a exterminationist logic in that case.
And it's extermination as a race-making project.
Exactly. Yeah, right. So it's making Jews white, right? I mean, we're continuing to make Jews white in new ways by making Muslims and Arabs and Palestinians vulnerable to extermination, right? Or available for extermination. That reflects, it is a continuity of Trump 1.0 in obvious ways, certainly, but I do think there's also a radicalization there that probably the single most important event in that radicalization, to your original question, Dan, is the 2020 uprising. I do think that continues to really fundamentally inform the right in this country. The kind of tactics of escalation around, ICE that we've been talking about, that Aslı was just describing, right? That is clearly in reference to the experience of 2020 and the desire to refight the battle of 2020, and from their perspective this time, win it decisively and with violence. And again, in doing so, redraw the lines of white supremacy in what they view as a more advantageous way. I also think that the fact that the Democrats also proved to be a party of white supremacy willing to sanction genocide and extermination, this is not news to anyone, right? But gave enormous room for that kind of race-making project. And the fact that a politics of equal humanity that says that, races have no fundamental basis in non-social reality is actually being pushed beyond the margins right now. And that I think that does put us back again in an earlier 20th century moment in a certain way. Just again, with a kind of trivial Zoran-related example, folks probably have seen the insane New York Times article from yesterday about his college application, the source for which is an anonymous online Nazi, right? Who the Times just gives him anonymity. In fact, his identity is known already, but they just allow him to claim anonymity, provide them a bunch of hacked material that doesn't even show anything of any interest or significance. And, that happened because there's a social connection between, race and IQ eugenics, fake intellectuals, and liberal journalists at the New York Times, right? And so, right, they knew each other already. That's why that happened. And what that means is that the battle to redraw the lines of race, to reconstitute white supremacy on a new basis, and to establish the legitimacy of belief in things like the stable biological basis of racial hierarchy. We're losing it. They're winning it right now.
Can I
Please.
just jump in for a sec with a couple of other thoughts on this? Like, why can this be successful here? So Gabe said, like, this, there are echoes here of earlier 20th century moments, which is absolutely right. And I want to draw a little bit on the work of Aziz Rana in answering this question, just to think about the long 20th century as he's described it. So what were the prerequisites of a racial inclusion project and imagining the United States and its constitutional compact as one that promoted racial inclusion and that both Democrats and Republicans would subscribe to in the 20th century? There were a lot of different factors that made it possible, but the most important one was the Cold War ideological imperative of competition for the non-white world and the need to basically end segregation and come up with a different idea about what our constitutional order requires. And so there's a story that he tells about, you know, a creedal constitutionalism, the Constitution as ineluctably moving towards racial progress and racial inclusion, understanding slavery and Jim Crow as aberrations. And it was a bipartisan consensus in the context of the Cold War around a kind of racial liberalism, if you want, that was, you know, exemplified by Brown v. Board, by the Voting Rights Act, by the Civil Rights Act, and so on. But beginning already in the 1970s, elements of this constitutional compact had begun to give way. There was really, it depended on a lot of things. It depended not just on the Cold War, but on the architecture of the New Deal, on ideas of social welfare, on ideas of using the administrative state to advance constitutional goals, et cetera, that were being defected from pretty clearly with the neoliberal turn by the Republican Party. Not on racial terms, but on economic terms, but removing some of the necessary pillars. And then with the end of the Cold War, you basically had the lifting of the core underlying imperative. Well, what preceded that idea of racial liberalism and racial inclusion as a constitutional strategy in the US was a basic default of ethno-national settler colonial policies and politics combined with forms of economic populism. And so when we say Trump is, what we're really saying is we are witnessing a kind of, let's say, resurfacing of things that were always latent and present and have been increasingly pronounced and themselves have long benefited from bipartisan support. So exactly as Gabe says, if this race-making project includes genocide in Gaza and extermination of Muslims and Arabs in the name of the production of an expanded white supremacy that has room now for Jewish communities, maybe other communities to be included, then that was obviously a bipartisan project, right? That, I mean, it was ushered in by the Biden administration, the framings of anti-Semitism that they then allowed to be weaponized, the conflation of anti-Semitism and critiques of Israeli policies, all of that precedes Trump. Trump just steps into a moment. I mean, I say it precedes this version of Trump. Of course, the groundwork for that was laid by the earlier version of Trump, but we could tell a story now that's essentially a post-1990 story. It's a story about what 9/11, like the prerequisites that have been put in place one by one, and what Trump is now doing. I mean, so again, coming back to the idea of Trump 2.0 as an accelerant, is basically finally removing all of the remaining institutional pillars of that earlier 20th century compact. And so this, again, raises the question, well, what might come after that? Well, one thing that might come after that is a kind of durable ethno-national politics, a durable politics of white supremacy. And we see lots of reasons why climate, you know, and the migration consequences of climate, war, et cetera, are engendering a white nationalist politics that's transnational, and maybe that Trump gets to lead in this moment because of his theatrical presidency, let's say. But there are other alternatives. And one of the things we need to think about and talk about is how do you build on the seeds of those alternatives in moments like this one, which are really themselves a kind of interregnum, a kind of time between the old and the new, both on the global level, and I know we're going to get to that later in this conversation, but also domestically for the reasons we've described.
We keep, I think, and very helpfully keep connecting the domestic to the global, and as you mentioned, to Amy Césaire's concept of the imperial boomerang, which seems so powerfully at work right now in so many ways. And I want to ask you to kind of get into more detail about the ways that you see the boomerang working. How do you see the various crises and contradictions of American empire after the end of the Cold War, with the onset of the War on Terror, and then with the onset and intensification of the genocide in Gaza, at work in domestic politics right now? What kind of lines can we draw from George W. Bush's unitary executive to Donald Trump's authoritarian fascism? And And then how does the boomerang then kind of like boomerang back out into the world? How do we see that remade American domestic politics then remaking how the U.S. is managing its global imperialist project from Gaza and Iran to China and Russia and elsewhere?
There are many, many ways in which one can answer this question. Obviously, I think one could reasonably even say that it's sort of the central question of the historical moment. A good place to start might be that the project that we sometimes call like neoliberal globalization is an instance of was an instance of American empire, right? A particular strategy of American empire, a way of relating the American ruling class to other national ruling classes that it sought to, absorb into itself as subordinate partners, to access the workforces that they had access to, right? That's a kind of classic version of what neoliberal globalization was, right? That by building a relationship with international diplomatic relationship with international ruling classes in poorer societies, right? That U.S. capital would then be able to access cheaper labor. It obviously had a kind of harder edge, right, in the forms of repressive violence, either directly undertaken occasionally by U.S. power or more often outsourced to different kinds of clients, or undertaken covertly over the course of many decades, right? We all know many examples of all of these instances. And so this is, I think, probably a consensus point in this room, right? But the thing that we often kind of shorthand is like neoliberalism, which seems to be coming to an end, or globalization, which seems to be coming to an end, was a strategy of empire. And I think we need to say that first in order to then understand the different dimensions of boomerang. And just to name a few quickly, I mean, the one that most obviously, or the two that most obviously kind of enabled and seemed to authorize the Trump phenomenon were, on the one hand, the economics of the global division of labor, right, and the reallocation of industrial employment away from the United States to sites of cheaper labor, disorganized a rival political coalition in this country between a different fraction of the ruling class and a fraction of the working class that had been an important coalition over the course of the 20th century in securing the basic social compact, right? I know I'm saying that kind of abstractly, but that's sort of the story of the disintegration of that kind of, the liberal wing of the capitalist class and the wing of the working class coming together around liberalism in the 20th century. That destroyed that. Two, it destabilized, both through violence and through economic disruption, societies around the world, generating migration streams, right, which made their ways to the global north. And that interacted with the reorganization of the global division of labor to aggravate it as a political phenomenon. This is all to re-describe really familiar events in slightly abstracted terms. Three, then the management of what now appeared increasingly in this country as an economically dislocated, decomposed, and disorganized working class, much more like the ones in the global south that had been the objects of imperial control and management for decades. That phenomenon appeared here, both in the form of economically dislocated US-born citizens who were generating social problems of different kind, whether discontent or things that were understood as social pathology or unemployment or whatever, that needed policing, right? And also people making their way to this country from the global south, looking to secure conditions of their own survival, who also then kind of entered into that surplus population and also needed policing. Those things became the occasion for the deployment of technologies of control that had been very well developed over decades overseas. So I think that's the sort of basic outlines of the story. There's no element of that we don't all already know. But I do think that sometimes when we talk about a colonial boomerang in the kind of Césaire sense, there's a risk of thinking of it as a kind of metaphorical or metaphysical or whatever, right? How does that actually work?
Like karmic.
Yeah, right, exactly. And it's not karmic, right? It works through a set of processes that we actually all understand really well already and have seen play out before our eyes and are hard to grasp sometimes in those terms only because of the kind of unconscious intellectual nationalism that I think it's easy to slip into even as a kind of confirmed anti-nationalist, internationalist person. But I do think when you start to push yourself out of that unconscious nationalist way of thinking about things, right? What's happening in Gaza is fundamentally related to, what's been happening in Los Angeles, for example, right? Those things, they're not just comparable, they're not just kind of metaphorically related, they are parts of the same process.
Yeah, I mean, the other ways in which, I mean, this question can be answered in many ways, but fundamentally the idea of a hard line between the domestic and the global is unsustainable for any kind of meaningful left politics. So we have to be able to find ways to think about and understand how these things are interwoven, how power operates, why this is all part of one institutional structure, especially when you're at the heart of empire, because what the United States does abroad is intrinsically part of the same police state power that's being exercised at home. But it is hard to see for the reasons Gabe was just describing. And there are moments where it becomes much more obvious. So like Gaza is a really apparent example where in order to continue to facilitate genocide, it was necessary to build a massive repressive machinery internal to the country. And it had bipartisan support, as American empire has bipartisan support, generally speaking, in the United States. So we saw, I mean, very literally, I mean, there's also the other sense in which the same systems that are enabling genocide in Gaza are systems that are tied to mass incarceration in the United States. Literally, sometimes similar corporations. I mean, the UN Special Rapporteur just published a list of the 60 corporations that are most directly profiting from genocide, and it included Lockheed Martin and Caterpillar and, you know, a whole host of all the like known usual suspects of US, you know, industrial subsidy global capitalist footprint for which each of us pays and which also helps fuel the repressive machinery at home. So that's a really clear example, but there are other really clear examples, like the criminalization of the border is a physical manifestation of where the global and the domestic literally meet. And the idea of the kinds of things that we're doing, so for example, that you have a kind of archipelago of repression globally that Trump is now turning into his own chain of authoritarian spaces, territories, so that you can take 8 people at the southern border, literally one of whom is Mexican, at the border with Mexico, and deport this person to South Sudan with the legitimation of the Supreme Court as of yesterday, is part of a vision, or the Venezuelans in El Salvador, I mean, the vision of how you can repurpose these relationships in order to globalize the mass incarceration model, while at the same time using the border to criminalize both internal and external populations and then dispose of them at will, right? It's the continuation of that exterminationist politics that we see at play so viscerally in Gaza, but it's actually, I mean, it's just less spectacular in the way that it unfolds, but it's the same repressive machinery. And of course, it is tied to the George W. Bush unitary executive. I mean, there are clear through lines. There are clear continuities, right? He just passed a neoliberal bill. I mean, there's no other way to describe that bill. I mean, people think of him as an economic populist, but at the end of the day, he's privatizing, he's slashing welfare provision, he's disabling the state from being able to ever honor social welfare commitments on the one hand, and he's also a neocon. He's engaging in grotesque, adventurous military interventionism abroad. But there are twists, there are ways in which it's different. There is a whiff of economic populism around his preferred method of taxation, namely tariffs. And there is something different between military interventions that are presented to the American public as liberation or are presented to the American public in humanitarian terms. We're told that places that we're intervening are going to be reconstructed somehow for the better, the narratives that we had around Afghanistan and Iraq, and simply intervention for the sake of smashing things up, which gets us back to the earlier questions of nihilism. I mean, what we're seeing now, and this is, again, a shared project. It's not just a Trumpian and US project. It's clearly hand in glove with Israel, which has in many ways innovated this idea. But it is war for the sake of destruction alone. That is the goal, the end state is simply exterminationist and destructive of the underlying infrastructure without any plan, indeed opposed to the replacement then of those structures and systems on the territories that are being destroyed with something else that could be functional. It's failed state as end goal. It's the idea of smashing things up and balkanizing them and leaving them weak and fragile in order to ensure that they don't become a source of threat subsequently in the sort of existential self-understanding of the Israeli state, but also just more generally. This isn't incarcerating people for some even deterrent purpose, I would say. Like, this is really like, it's about the spectacle of and the capacity to use coercion and double down on the unconstrained access to repressive machinery to serve whatever ends, are named by the state. And that, again, is the difference between a time like 2003, immediately after 9/11, when that earlier 20th century compact is still within living memory and present, when you have to present your arguments in terms of a self-understanding of the United States as a benign actor in the world, advancing freedom, et cetera. And today, where we simply, to the extent that we have any register of freedom at all, it's like the freedom to dominate, perhaps. But there's no greater vision. And this is where Trump, again, people see him as distinctive because he says, we're a nation like any other. We're just like Russia. We're just like China. And this is a moment, as I said earlier, of interregnum, not just domestically, where we're reconfiguring what our constitutional order is going to be in the wake of what has been a destructive dismantling of institutions. It's also globally that this is an empire in the throes of its decline, which is defecting radically from the terms of its earlier global arrangement, the so-called liberal international order, and in which it seems to be, at least to the extent that Trump has a vision of it, instead seeking to replace it with a kind of competitive authoritarian concert of powers, a sphere of influence kind of logic at which the different peripheries as they're defined, by the discretion of the authoritarians that Trump sees as his principal interlocutors at the moment, seemingly Putin, Xi, maybe a small handful of other, Netanyahu, et cetera, how they define the margins of those spheres of influence that they're creating. And so the question for the Middle East and the smash up that we're seeing at the moment is the United States prepared to sign on to a long-term strategy of Israeli regional hegemony? Does that seem viable? Is the United States going to continue believing that the Middle East somehow constitutes its sphere of influence? Who are other rivals? But these are the new terms that we're seeing emerging. And the terms are terms that are about remilitarization, about doubling down on coercive powers, about competition that is destructive and militarist to its core. And that conscripts domestic populations in the project, right? We're conscripted not just literally, like we don't have a draft, but at the end of the day, it's working Americans that end up being the foot soldiers of these projects. But also we're like conscripted in an economy that is organized around these principles, that's organized around a project of this kind of new conception of primacy, which is pure military coercion, domination, and the concentration of a sphere of influence while establishing some kind of entente with privileged, preferred authoritarians. These are really frightening visions. So again, the imperative to find an alternative way of putting the point on the through line we're witnessing at the moment is, I think, serious.
I'm Naomi Klein, and you're listening to The Dig, my go-to podcast for the most thoughtful, in-depth conversation on the left. It's an incredible place to be exposed to new ideas and new writing. And if you can, please become a sustaining supporter at Patreon.
This episode of The Dig, like every episode of The Dig, is produced in partnership with Jacobin Magazine. Jacobin is an incredible publication, and you've probably seen a lot of what they've published online. But they also have a really beautiful print magazine. It comes out quarterly and has well over 100 pages packed with illustrations, infographics, and some of the best graphic design in the country. Dig listeners can join 50,000 Jacobin subscribers developing socialist political thought and debate for just $15 a year. $15 gets you an entire year of Jacobin in print and access to the magazine's entire back catalog. If you've never subscribed to Jacobin before, you can access this deal by going to bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase. That's bit.ly/digjacobin, bit.ly/digjacobin, all lowercase.
I do want to return in a few minutes to what seems like an important question of why Trump can't help but being a neocon and a neoliberal, because that seems to be important. But first, let's drill down on ICE and DHS and how they really exemplify in an unparalleled way this imperial boomerang at work. Aslı, as you mentioned, how just dangerous and novel it is, the creation of such a giant federal law enforcement agency that's just going to get, and that exploded really in the wake of 9/11 with the war on terror, and that's going to get just to reach another order of magnitude thanks to the one big beautiful bill. And interestingly and frighteningly, Trump has used ICE, of course, to perpetuate his agenda of mass deportation, but also to explicitly, brazenly, without subtlety, to use ICE or DHS to target non-citizens who've engaged in pro-Palestine speech or action, and increasingly to target kind of democratic elected officials for arrest and repression. What in particular do you make of ICE being the law enforcement agency that's become Trump's MAGA Gestapo, that then creates these conflicts that become the pretext to actually put Marines in the streets?
So I think, again, we need to step back and see how we got here a little bit. So that 20th Century Compact included an understanding of the state as a national security state entitled to a tremendous amount of deference when the executive invokes national security, and national security came to be essentially swallowed up most of our commitments. So it could mean, defense of primacy, it could mean defense of, American hegemony in far-flung parts of the world, but it can also mean a conception of the homeland that famously became part of our, institutional infrastructure of the government after 9/11, the homeland and its interest as defined by the executive. So first you have that very wide sort of deference that is provided to the executive when it asserts national security prerogatives. And then post 9/11, you have grafted onto that, as you said, the George W. Bush theory of the unitary executive that has only been propounded with greater and greater, depth and monopolization of violence in the person of the presidency since the George W. Bush idea was advanced and has been embraced by the jurisprudence of the apex court in this country. So these two things together mean that, first of all, the use of an agency that's described as committed to homeland security instantly engenders a level of absence of legal constraint that is basically not possible when you're describing the ordinary, workings of the policing machinery of the country. So ICE exemplifies both the pure coercion politics that I was describing a moment ago and the total lack of meaningful legal constraint on conduct that the courts have ushered in. Yeah. Which is longstanding, right? Which is the culmination of a decades-long process that I would say goes back to the late 40s in terms of affording this kind of deference to the invocations of national security, and then on top of that, adding on a homeland security apparatus and the unitary executive theory, such that today the idea that we have, for example, constitutional constraints or rights-based restrictions on the conduct of the executive when it invokes national security at the border or in the interior, as long as it's speaking in this language, or abroad, is just basically inchoate. I mean, no court, not even the district courts, no court imagines, and you can't litigate it. And so even as we see something that seems utterly lawless, the targeting of individuals based exclusively on their speech or associational action, seizing of people without even basic procedural protections and disappearing them literally, moving them around in order to escape the possibility of any jurisdictional claim being made, and now even, taking them to parts of the world that they are being left in specifically in order that they have no prospect of physical survival in those places. All of this is not just being permitted, and as I said earlier, I think there's a sort of strategy of testing the limits. So because this strategy of ICE has been so successful, hence the massive increase, $150 billion increase in its budget and the massive scale of it today, ICE, as it turns out, there is no limit, right? The Supreme Court just made it possible yesterday to lawfully leave these 8 deported men in South Sudan, and it's very likely to do something similar with respect to the abductions and transfers of people to El Salvador, and then the doors open. I mean, it's basically a kind of neoliberal policing bonanza, if you want, in which countries around the world are presented with an incentive scheme in which they can escape tariffs or they can be given privileged access to markets in exchange for agreeing to take surplus populations designated by the president himself and seized by this paramilitary force and transferred out, and there aren't any apparent constitutional legal constraints. So that explains why ICE. I think it's simply the path of least resistance. It's the place that you can go after a near 3/4 of century of logic being put in place that enables an unconstrained path. So that's one, I think, important piece of it. But it's also the idea that the repressive, coercive machinery of the state is now being instrumentalized in the hands of an executive against its enemies. So the two pieces of the Trump governance from 1.0 to 2.0 that remain continuous in my view is the subordination of the state to his personal preferences and its use against enemies in the sharpest possible way, but also in defense of and to enrich friends. And so the bill itself represents both sides, to my mind, of that coin, and ICE is just one piece. One has to be able to see both together to understand both the domestic and the global implications of the move.
Gabe?
I do think it's really notable, in the exact vein that Aslı is saying, that the logic and language of ICE as a protector of national security, right? It is a logic and language of war, right? And that, I mean, right, the enemy combatants justification, for example. I think the idea that, I mean, we're used to a right-wing idea of an internal enemy. That's a kind of familiar, if always frightening, invocation, right? The idea that there is an internal enemy who can be legally recognized as a belligerent in war, as a hostile belligerent in war, merely by their presence in this country, and therefore made the target of enormous right-wing paramilitary force that's established within the government. Right? I mean, again, on the kind of fascism point, right? The idea that internal political struggle, conflicts over questions like immigration and distribution and so on, right, are understood in terms of race war, which is what is being said. That, right? I mean, that is like truly a hallmark of fascism. And I think also, right, there's an inbuilt logic of escalation in the proposed enormous expansion of ICE. And I think that works in a couple of ways. One, who are they going to hire for these, thousands of new ICE agent jobs that are going to be created? Who are they going to hire? Who's going to want to do that? It creates a way of putting a badge on like
far-right thugs.
Far-right thugs, exactly, yeah. And I think we will see that happen very dramatically, and that I think we should all be quite frightened of. Two, to the point I was making kind of earlier about how they can't actually solve any of the political problems through deportation that they propose to solve. I mean, not to be hyperbolic, right? But Nazi Germany also couldn't solve any of Germany's problems by deporting and exterminating Jews and Romani people and so, right? Like, that wasn't an actual solution. It was a political solution that reconstituted, German society in certain ways, right? To kind of feed the power of Nazism. And I think similarly, what we will see is that with the deportation machine expanded that dramatically, filled in terms of personnel in this way, right, that it will, of necessity, expand its range of targets, right? And this is, again, this is something Trump talks openly about, right? We have to find a way to go after the native borns and so on.
Or to denaturalize Mamdani.
Yeah, exactly, right. I think they will try to do that. And as that proceeds, right, and as it continues to not solve the problem that it purports to solve, its logic will feed and multiply itself, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point, that we can only take so much comfort in the insight that the resolution to these contradictions on their part is only provisional. There's still so much danger and damage that can be done even with provisional resolutions. I want to return to that point about Trump's insistence on just being like a neocon and neoliberal, which does seem like a major obstacle for converting dominance to hegemony. And it seems like maybe people like Josh Hawley and Steve Bannon do have a plausible roadmap to how the far right could turn it into dominance with hegemony, with a sort of like Herrenvolk social democracy and combined with isolationism on the international level, but they just can't do it. And my question for you is why? Is it just because of the capitalist class power and the far right coalition that won't let it happen? Or is it a ideological commitment to what Quinn Slobodian would call, a more radical mutant strains of neoliberalism? Why can't they just listen to Steve Bannon?
I mean, I do think that there is, notwithstanding the base that Trump has courted, I think there is a fundamental antagonism in the class politics that he represents. That means that the Josh Hawley vision, at least, the one that would provide some version of social welfare on a, sort of ethno-nationalist basis, but nonetheless, and meet core forms of economic populism, not exclusively through protectionism, but also through policies that actually transfer wealth, that is anathema to Trump and the groups that are behind him. I mean, the people to whom he has turned over policymaking are not actually the Josh Hawleys or Steve Bannons in this iteration, right? They're the true billionaire class. I mean, it really is like an incredible empowerment
Of literal individual billionaires.
Yes, literally. I mean, like watching the wealthiest man in the world obliterate a set of programs and policies that were designed to help the perhaps poorest populations on the globe, in the case of USAID, is a kind of perfect image of what the current Trump administration is about. And so it would entail grafting on to the Trump's current predilections, let's say, an actual concern for the base that has in some ways brought him to power that I think is just absent, and the coalition that he at the moment has empowered does not encompass those actors, although those actors helped bring him to power, especially in the case of Steve Bannon. I don't have a more complex answer, I don't think, than that one, but Gabe.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think also, I mean, I agree with you, Dan, that it would seem that the kind of Bannon, Herrenvolk, social democracy vision would appear to be the path toward a more stable kind of popular basis and hegemony, if you like. But it's not just that they can't do that because of the internal class, the class interest of the billionaires represented within their coalition, although I do think that's the primary obstacle. I also think that kind of project is generally really hard to do. I mean, we get the phrase Herrenvolk democracy from apartheid South Africa. And apartheid South Africa was an extraordinarily internally contradictory regime that collapsed under the pressure of social insurgency, right? A lesson from which surely these people have learned. As I think if we learned anything about our current ruling regime, right? The influence of apartheid South Africa is one thing that we've discovered. And I think there's a real reason for that, which is that when you begin to make those kinds of class concessions, even attempting to demarcate them racially, on racial lines, even successfully largely demarcating them on racial lines, you still create, I think, potentially less controlled social feedback loops. Once there are existing pockets of working class organization and solidarity, even racist pockets of working class organization and solidarity, right? They have a certain kind, I mean, they're partly co-opted, but or significantly co-opted, but they also nonetheless generate a kind of basis for conflict and instability and challenge within limits, but within limits that can be broken down potentially. And I do, here, to go back to the New Deal comparison, I think is helpful, right? The New Deal, complicated regime, obviously, right? In the South was a kind of case of Herrenvolk, social democracy wouldn't even be the right word, but
democracy, well, yeah.
Something.
Herrenvolk something.
Right, but in the North, was also, entangled with white supremacy, but in a less straightforward and clear-cut way, such that the attempt to deliver a kind of partial and limited welfare state and system of labor protections on a partially racially demarcated basis, nonetheless still created openings wide enough for black workers to become organized, politically engaged, politically mobilized. And that is the pressure from below that went with the Cold War context to create that post-war racial liberal kind of, consensus, right? It was the fact that even this really limited and compromised and racist welfare state construction still had enough cracks in it that basically black workers managed to organize themselves and wedge those cracks open. And I do think that is another really important limit on their ability to establish the kind of stable coalition that you're describing, and that in some ways I think all of us probably breathed a sigh of relief that they're sort of not able to do. But I think it's actually, I too, right? If they had pursued the kind of Bannon populist route, that would be scarier, I think, in certain ways. But I think that it's actually like pretty hard to do that without losing a bunch of ground they don't want to lose in other ways.
Let's turn to what we should be doing about all of this. The Biden administration began with the Bernie left in a coalition of sorts with the center as Biden embraced organized labor more than any other modern president, worked to pass what was initially a very ambitious Build Back Better bill, and it was the left alone who backed Biden when he pulled U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. But of course, Biden's fervent backing for Israel's genocide in Gaza spectacularly shattered that coalition. And by election day 2024, the Harris campaign's central message to the left was essentially to go fuck itself. Today, the left and the Democratic establishment remain at war. I would say, pretty much in the same kind of dynamic that we were locked in last year. And yet, much of the actual rank and file liberal base appears to be realigning around left leadership. And this seems like a very important, deep, tectonic sort of movement in American politics that's underway. Look at Zoran's victory and the giant coalition that he built. Look at the giant lib turnout at AOC and Bernie's anti-oligarchy rallies. Gabe, how do you think about left liberal coalitions at the present conjuncture, and how do you conceive of what to me seems to be a really historic shift leftward among the liberal Democratic voter base as that base becomes profoundly, or at least portions of that base, become profoundly alienated from party leadership?
Yeah, I mean, I think you described it well. I think there is a kind of political opportunity in this moment. I'm one who does believe that the left is too small to win without liberals, and I wish that were not the case.
Is what it is.
But I think it is what it is. And I understand why over years now people have reacted to that kind of people on the left have reacted to that kind of assertion, rightly, by pointing out that what that always winds up meaning is that we have to follow them. Right? And the kind of logic of the liberal-led popular front into which we're kind of coerced into participating out of fear of what's worse. And, that's a valid response to that, I think. But I do think that the total failure, 10 years of systematic failure adding up to fucking nothing, and worse, right? Much worse than nothing, of that liberal proposition. It's incumbent on us to make that case, and we are making it, and we'll continue to make it, and we should make it louder and better and talk about how to do that. But I also think, it's sort of hard to miss, and I always think about, there was an interview, I can't remember where, but I saw it maybe 2 months before the New York primary. There was a person who was caught by a journalist, or maybe it was just even social media, I can't remember. But I remember her details. She was 61. She was identified as a child care worker living in Brooklyn. And she said to whoever was asking her the question about the mayor's race, I never used to be with the left. She used a formulation like that. But Bernie and AOC are the only ones fighting for us. And this was kind of her explanation of why she had decided to rank Zoran number one. And I do think that is really out there in a big way. And I think that the kind of tactical challenge is to figure out how to capture that feeling by continuing to attack the leadership of the liberal establishment without making people who have been led by that leadership previously also targets of the attack, right? I do think, and this is hard politically, right? When you feel rightly like you've had it right for a long time and a bunch of people missed the boat and helped get us where we are by missing the boat, right? It's really easy to relate to them as antagonists, and they are partly antagonists, but they're not totally antagonists. And so I think, our obligation, I think, is to present ourselves as the people who, unlike Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, unlike maybe establishment and incumbent leaders of many of the more conservative unions, unlike a lot of the institutions, the kind of liberal institutions of the press and academia and so on, have an answer now, right? So many of the liberal institutions and their leaders just have nothing to say, nothing to offer, nothing. And in whatever institution, liberal institution you might find yourself, for me it's the university, but I think for others it's how we might relate to the press or nonprofits or even our labor unions or whatever, right? We look at them and we see them having fucking nothing. And I think on the left let me just give a more concrete example. This year I became the president of my campus's chapter of the American Association of University Professors, and at our campus, as at many campuses, AUP has grown. We grew from 15 to 205 over 6 months. 205 is still a minority, but that's fast growth, right? At a place like the University of Chicago, especially. And strangers who started stopping me in the hallway saying, "Thank you for what you're doing." And I find it a little bit annoying sometimes, I admit, because I'm like, well, you could be doing it too. And I try to find a nice way to say that. But I also think, I also do take a genuine kind of encouragement from that, right? That actually people realize, they see who is fighting and who is not. And I don't think we have captured even a fraction of the amount of political capital that there is to capture in that recognition. And I think it's incumbent on us now to proliferate organizations and institutions and tactics to capture more of it.
Yeah, I think it's no surprise that the Trump administration is going after universities, the media, professional associations, bar associations, law firms, et cetera. They're identifying a kind of mapping of where power lies potentially on the left. I mean, I said earlier, the Democrats don't understand themselves as an opposition party, and that's incredibly frustrating because they're still trying to play like, centrist politics in a context where none of the institutional prerequisites are present anymore. But again, this presents an opportunity. I agree completely with Gabe that the left is too small to win on its own. It has to be a left liberal coalition, but the left can lead that coalition. The left can redefine what the median is for the Democratic Party or for the opposition party in the United States by whatever name that party is going to go. Because at the end of the day, like, that's the opportunity we have. We have to do that because there is no path forward for the old center that they're trying to defend. It simply doesn't, the conditions do not exist for that politics today. And we have the right analysis of what the conditions are at the moment. And the Trump administration understands that actually we do have sources of power. We have an ecosystem. It is defined as liberal, as exactly as Gabe said. Universities are, to the extent they can, exhibiting nothing but cowardice at the moment in the face of the onslaught that they face. The attempt to dominate higher education is proceeding with capitulation after capitulation. But at the end of the day, we're in these power bases too. And the reason that they perceive, what is the basis of their culture politics, their race politics, their gender politics, all of this are attempts to go after what they understand to be the bases of power of sites of resistance to their own project, to their minoritarian project. So we have to remember some basic things. They are a minority. They may be a plurality, but they're not a majority that support Trump. Even in the most recent election, he wasn't able to get to an actual majority, and he underperformed other anti-incumbent backlash political elections of the same year. So one, they don't have a majority. Two, actually, these are sites of important cultural power, and we need to own them and claim them. And I completely agree with Gabe that one way we're seeing that happening is through the national mobilization of AAUPs and the fact that AAUP is actually joining with unions, that actually it is trying to build alliances and coalitions nationally with unions. We have to think about, like, how do we strengthen the position? For me, it's always the domestic and the global together. So how do we think about global labor in this moment? How do we think about these broader criminalization strategies as they are unfolding, as I've said, at the border, but transnationally, and try to oppose those things? And the place I would begin, and I would also say this for anti-war politics today, I would begin with this big, beautiful budget. I would say that the security budget and the attempt to dismantle the basic funding sources for all of the projects that earlier 20th century compact entailed, right? We just saw the impoundment of funding to the Department of Education's programs and public education. So the attack on public education, the attack on higher education, the attack on professional associations, the attack on law firms, the attack on civil society everywhere we find it, produces its own opportunity for us to actually step in with an alternative opposition politics in defense of those sites of power. So the New York Times today is platforming Nazis. They also ran an unbelievable, strange op-ed yesterday about why we need to end pathways to legal citizenship. The incoherence and lunacy of that platform is unbelievable. But at the end of the day, it represents one of the establishment media sites that are also themselves under attack at the moment. And so defending that kind of the power that exists in that media establishment means also remaking the terms on which we enter into any of those partnerships, right? We have to divest from the things that are actual antagonists, but also build power in the places that we're present in ways that make a future opposition politics possible, that redefine the median on the terms of the left. And I think that's really where we're at, because meaningful leadership, when you see Chuck Schumer vote for the GOP budget bill, you know it's over. There isn't an establishment leadership that understands anything like opposition politics. It's remarkable. And actually, again, when you look globally, you look around the world, you see that it takes time for the traditional opposition to remake itself in some way in the face of this kind of populist authoritarian strategy. And so I kept saying I was on a visit to family in Turkey, and I kept saying it's just astonishing the level of vibrant, resilient opposition politics still enacted every day in the streets in this country, and the complete lack of its corollary in the United States for the most part. But, as I then thought about it in conversation, it's like, 23 years of learning has produced an opposition that actually has a meaningful left politics, a serious base, cares about its relationship to that constituency, that set of constituencies, and takes real risks. Party leaders get arrested and put in jail, and the party continues organizing. Here we have like the theatrics that we've seen of ICE efforts to, whatever, but you see a full retreat from the party leadership as it stands today. And so we really have a kind of vacuum in the Democratic Party, I think. And it's not just that there's a fracture. Of course there's a fracture, and it's the ongoing one, the one that we saw in the Harris campaign and before it. I mean, ever since Gaza, it has been out in the open, being sort of narrated every time in all of the potential spaces in which we see democratic politics at play. But there's also a vacuum. It's not just a fracture. There is no, in my view, meaningful establishment leadership that can galvanize anybody at the moment. And so that provides us with an opportunity and a platform, to my mind.
A. Philip Randolph was the founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and the architect of two movements to march on Washington. And in 1936, at the inaugural meeting of the National Negro Congress, he argued that unions, particularly CIO unions that had just led huge strikes across the country, that they represented a genuine alternative to fascism, a remedy more real, more important than the project of the New Deal itself. For Randolph, and this was true of many of his contemporaries as well, the invention of what he called, quote, democratic institutions, the arena in which alone their economic power may be built. He believed that this represented the means and ends of the alternative to far-right authoritarianism and the capitalist crisis that was generating that far-right authoritarianism in the first place. I want to close by asking, where do you see the seeds of that sort of alternative order today? Or to put it maybe more generally, how would you two thread the needle between defeating the far right and working toward the construction of socialism?
I think, as Randolph said in 36, we would want to say again now that while there are kind of moments along the pathway where you can probably distinguish between competing political imperatives to deal fascism a defeat here, win and advance for socialism there, from our perspective where we sit at this moment, I think it's very hard to see the distinction between them, actually. And again, as Randolph said, and as you quoted, Dan, the imperative to try to construct institutions of democratic practice and activity in everyday life, and to give those institutions real meaning and life, and to put them to the test of actual struggle, and to win those struggles, is both at a strategic level, the way to check the advance and ultimately reverse the advance of fascism, to reclaim parts of society from their kind of ongoing fascization by expanding the set of rights that we can claim through the only way that works, which is contentiously, and at the same time, it remakes us as we do that, right? It to become a viable subject of a fascist regime, right? A person has to get used to the idea of lack of any kind of effective civic agency in their own life except violence toward those below them, right? That's the only form of agency that fascism makes available.
Compensating their own domination through the domination of others.
Yeah, give or take. I mean, it works in different ways, but yeah. And that's working. I mean, they're doing that. That's working, right? And I do think we see people learning to take pleasure, as Aslı was saying, learning to take pleasure in the spectacle of deportation, right? In the spectacle of violence, feeling like they're represented in some way through that process. And to generate a different and more meaningful and substantive rich form of democratic feeling and experience, I think can only happen through not only economic struggles, workplace struggles, although that's a critical arena, but a variety of forms of democratic organization and struggle. And to try to be more concrete and specific, I do think that for all that Biden failed us and Trump is trying to, compound and expand that failure, the revival of the labor movement is still happening. It's not happening in the sense that it's growing our density, and that's an important distinction. To grow our density, we would have to recruit 1 million members a year to the labor movement, and at best we're doing like around 100,000. So we have a ways to go, to say the least. But nonetheless, right, there are struggles happening at many, many Amazon warehouses as we speak, right, and Whole Foods. And I mean, I won't go down the list, but the arena of just like worker solidarity, worker struggle, that's expanding. Immigrant right. I mean, I was hugely encouraged by the resistance that ICE found in Los Angeles and in other cities, but I think most prominently LA. Right, the idea that actually regular people will show up and fight. Everyone who's here believes that at some level, right? That's why you're at Socialism 2025. But there are moments when it seems not to be true for a moment, right? And it's really easy to kind of think like, shit, is that wrong? Do we have it wrong? And I do think Trump is teaching us again that regular people will show up and fight. And the immigrant rights movement has been and will continue to be an enormously important arena for that. Although how we take the kind of, I think, quite widespread popular revulsion at ICE and at the deportation regime and turn that into something more durable is a hugely important political question, right? And turn it into a site of democratic citizenship making and capacity building. But I guess those are the two kind of places I would point initially. It would be the labor movement, which they cannot kill for all that they try, and the immigrant rights movement, which again, they cannot kill for all that they try. And between them, those movements, that's millions of people, right, who in one form or another, whether just, showing up to a rally or just voting on their collective bargaining agreement, they sometimes very minimal forms and sometimes much braver forms, are showing that there is a floor that they cannot push us under.
I think you could make a similar point about the wide-scale opposition to war and how that translated into an anti-war movement with capacity, durability, scale.
Yeah, and again, you could say also, like, they cannot kill the Palestine movement, right? I mean, more than any other, right? That's the one where they just they would literally kill it if they could. And, they keep thinking they've done it, and they can't do it. And, that's not to say there's not really serious repression and huge setbacks and huge failure. I mean, I remember doing a panel with you here a year ago, Dan, where I said, we have to simultaneously acknowledge that we have totally failed to stop the genocide in Gaza, and that remains more true now even, right, a year later. And at the same time, the movement is, I think, in some ways way in excess of anything that one might have expected the American population might generate. And that also remains true, despite the fact that they'll break the country to destroy the movement if they have to, right? And they're trying to do that.
Yeah, so amen to all of that. I would completely sign on. I think labor movement, immigrant rights movement, these are definitely places to build on. And the Gaza, Palestine solidarity movement. I think there are a couple of things I would say. The first is that I think we need to look to building power, which is completely consistent with what Gabe said, as opposed to, say, for example, mass protest. Not because mass protest is not important. It is very important. We want to have broad mobilizations when we need them, because that's also part of the spectacle in a fascist moment of showing the opposition, showing that there's real resistance, that people will take risks and come out and are willing to enact their politics on the streets. But hypervisibility comes with incredible amount of risk in this current climate, and building power is something that also requires a lot of just quiet work outside of the spectacular, including the building of democratic practices internal to our institutions. So this is what I meant when I said Trump is doing the service of identifying all the places that he understands to be sources of political, cultural, and economic power on the left, and he's attacking them. And so all of them understand themselves now to be under assault. And so, first of all, they're available, therefore, to recruit to a politics of resistance. That's an opportunity for us. They also have internal governance practices of their own that are overwhelmingly anti-democratic and hierarchical that need to be transformed. And so those are sites for us to focus on. We also have a moment where, anti-war movements tend to rise through mass protest and through mass demonstrations and moments of spectacular violence. Gaza has furnished that, sadly, on a durable basis for 2 years. And so you've had constant mobilization around the never-ending stream of horrifying images of extermination. But if those images were to subside to some extent, there's a worry that you end up seeing demobilization in the same kinds of ways that happened in the wake of the Iraq War. So thinking about how do we create and build power that is effective and ongoing, that doesn't require necessarily that constant spectacle of violence. And again, the answer to me is this bill. It's the security budget. It's thinking about an anti-war movement that's a movement about our economic justice. I mean, that's really the core of what we need to say. We now are presiding over the full dismantling of the state in every capacity that it provides services, in every capacity that it represents even the most diminished version of something like, let's call it herrenfolk social welfare, and doubling down on a massively increasing a security state in its domestic and global instantiation, and demanding rearmament globally in addition to that, forcing other countries to adopt the same sets of budget priorities if they want to remain in the US sphere of influence. Amongst other things, we're literally sleepwalking into a third world war, a nuclear third world war. I mean, that's what the Iran strikes are, an astonishing act of absolute political lunacy that has become yesterday's news. That's not even the topic that we're primarily engaging today or anywhere else. That's insane. I mean, so to try to think clearly about the nature of the challenge that we face and understand the allies that are being produced in this moment as a consequence of the attacks across the board that the Trump administration is taking up, and then build power from internally within those institutions, but also keep our eyes on a prize. And to me, that prize is the prize of economic justice that goes in hand with immigrants' rights, that goes hand in hand with opposing the mass incarceration, the carceral state, climate justice. I mean, again, another topic we haven't even touched that this bill basically sets back by decades. I mean, we're now at a moment where we're back in a set of 19th century quandaries, but there are playbooks. I mean, the 19th century was the sort of backdrop to the emergence of a progressive movement. We can think about how does this scale of destructive force engender creative possibilities. And I think that's, I mean, so we've just begun that conversation as we're ending, right? But I think that's the point of Socialism 2025. I think it's the question we have to leave with and then begin from in every place that we're actually enacting politics in our lives. And those are places like universities and unions and professional associations and libraries and like all the places that are facing the defunding crisis that's the opposite side of the coin of that security budget, and connecting those dots in ways that enable us to both think about setting a different agenda, defining the median in a different way, and also mobilizing when we want to in a spectacular fashion when we want to demonstrate our power in the streets.
And I'll just add really quickly before we end, the tenant movement, which in LA, New York, absolutely. Connecticut, Rhode Island is organizing working class people around arguably the principal crisis and contradiction in working class people's everyday reality. And it's a politics that we saw become a very powerful vehicle for Zoran's victory in New York.
Absolutely.
All right, Aslı Bâli and Gabe Winant, thank you so much for that really, really powerful discussion.
That was Aslı Bâli and Gabriel Winant. Aslı Bâli is a professor of law at Yale Law School who focuses on public international law and has published essays and op-eds in such venues as the New York Times, Boston Review, the London Review of Books, Jacobin, and Dissent. Before joining academia, she worked for the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and currently serves as president of the Middle East Studies Association of North America, co-chair of the advisory board for the Middle East Division of Human Rights Watch, and is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Gabriel Winant teaches history at the University of Chicago. His first book was The Next Shift, The Fall of Industry and the Rise of Healthcare in Rust Belt America. He is currently an officer of the American Association of University Professors. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that, by now stigmatizing as socialistic what it had previously extolled as liberal, the bourgeoisie confesses that its own interests dictate that it should be delivered from the danger of its own rule. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Thea Riofrancos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also now Blue Sky and Instagram at The Dig Radio. And please find us wherever you get your podcasts and can subscribe. And if it's on iTunes, you can also leave us a glowing review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. So does spreading the word to your friends. Please, make propaganda for us. And please do find us on Patreon and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation going. Even a few bucks is extraordinarily helpful.